Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're having a fantastic day so far. So over the weekend, in a new warning from the Senate Majority Leader, Social Security payments for millions of Americans could be paused if this one thing happens or maybe doesn't happen. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden considers perhaps using the 14th Amendment to avoid this whole crisis. So we're going to be going over all this in today's video and so much more. But before we go ahead and dive into the main content, if you wouldn't mind helping me out real quickly by just giving this video a like, that just helps out with the good old YouTube algorithm, and also consider subscribing to my channel if you have not already. Okay, so before we go ahead and dive into all the news about Social Security payments possibly being paused according to the Senate Majority Leader and Joe Biden's considerations of using the 14th Amendment to avoid this whole crisis, first, I wanted to go into a news article by Fox News over the weekend as well, where a panel actually approved payments worth up to $1.2 million to every black resident. This would be in the state of California. So we're going to be going over this real quickly before we dive into the news. So the California Reparations Task Force formally recommended that the state offer payments of up to $1.2 million to every qualifying black resident. The task force held a public meeting in Oakland, California on Saturday and voted on the final set of recommendations to be sent to the state's legislators. The 9-member panel called on the state to offer its black residents a formal apology in addition to the payments. So the panel's recommendation breaks payments down by types of historical discrimination. For instance, black residents affected by redlining by banks would receive $3,366 for each year they lived in California from the early 1930s to the late 1970s, amounting to up to $148,099. Similarly, black residents could receive roughly $2,352 in compensation for over-policing and mass incarceration for each year they lived in California between 1970 and 2020. Those payments could amount to $115,260. In total, from these and other payments included in the plan, a black Californian who is 71 years old and has lived in California his entire life, they could receive up to $1.2 million, according to an analysis from the New York Times. The panel's Saturday vote included only recommendations for the state legislature and does not have any legal weight. Saturday's meeting included opposition from some black residents demanding larger payments, and activists identified as Reverend Tony Pierce as one of the more outspoken people at the gathering, making reference to the famous 40 acres and a mule promise to former slaves when he took the podium. So these are pretty huge payments. Again, this would have to pass the California State House and the California State Senate before being sent to Governor Newsom's desk to be signed into law. But let me know what you think about this bill in the comment section below. If you lived in California, or even if you don't live in California, do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Leave your thoughts in comments below. Now, moving into the whole debt ceiling and Social Security debate. Right now, yesterday over the weekend, once again, the Treasury Secretary and Janet Yellen had a dire warning if the debt ceiling is not raised, once again saying that it could be of very bad consequences if it does not take place. So according to CNN, senior Treasury officials reiterate dire warnings if debt ceiling isn't lifted, pour cold water on invoking the 14th Amendment, which we will get into later. So ahead of the highly anticipated meeting between President Joe Biden and congressional leaders on Tuesday, that's tomorrow, senior Treasury officials reiterate dire warnings of economic chaos and catastrophe if the U.S. doesn't raise the debt ceiling as the country barrels towards default in early June. She said, quote, "I know he wants to set up a process in which spending priorities and levels are discussed and negotiated, but these negotiations should not take place with a gun, really to the head of the American people. While congressional Republicans want to tie any debt ceiling hike to spending and budget cuts, the administration has said the two issues are separate." She said, quote, "If they fail to do it, we will have an economic and financial catastrophe that will be of our own making, and there is no action that President Biden and the U.S. Treasury can take to prevent the catastrophe." Her comments come as some have speculated about the possibility of President Biden invoking the 14th Amendment or taking other extreme action if the debt ceiling is not raised in time. Biden said, quote, "I have not gotten there yet." So according to Reuters, Biden said, not yet ready to invoke 14th Amendment to avoid debt default. Now, the Treasury Secretary is saying that would not be an option anyways, and of course that could be tied to a lot of lawsuits. So according to Reuters, if Congress fails to act, some legal experts say Biden has another option to avert a crisis: invoke the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution to ensure the United States can continue to pay its bills. Now we're going to get to how all this will tie into the potential pause of Social Security payments in just a moment. Section 4 of the amendment, adopted after the 1861 to 1865 Civil War, states that the, quote, validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned, but the clause has been largely unaddressed by the courts. Some experts have suggested that Biden could invoke this amendment to raise the debt ceiling on his own if Congress does not act. That would almost certainly lead to prolonged legal wrangling, which could unsettle financial markets. Now, I obviously wouldn't put this against Joe Biden for doing this. I could definitely see him doing something such as this, especially if he went ahead and forgave up to $20,000 worth of student loans. A lot of people said that would not be legal. Guess what? He went ahead and did it anyway. So I definitely would not put it out of the possibility that he could go ahead and invoke the 14th Amendment to raise the debt ceiling by himself without congressional approval. But we will definitely have to wait and see. Now, this is going to be especially important, that meeting tomorrow, because the House, last week went ahead and raised the debt ceiling on their own. They had a lot of spending cuts. Now in the Senate, Democrats have the majority in the Senate, so there's no way that bill is going to pass. It's pretty much dead on arrival. But the Senate Minority Leader McConnell over the weekend also warned that he won't back a debt ceiling increase without substantive reforms. And then, of course, according to CNN, there are now 43 Senate Republicans vowing to oppose debt ceiling increase without spending cuts. So even the Republicans in the Senate are saying that we need to have spending cuts in order to raise the debt ceiling. So according to CNN, all but 6 Senate Republicans on Saturday vowed to oppose raising the debt ceiling without substantive spending and budget reforms, backing up House Speaker Kevin McCarthy's position. The group of 43 Republican senators, led by Senator Mike Lee of Utah, said they are united behind the House Republican Conference in support of spending cuts and structural budget reform as a starting point for negotiations on the debt ceiling, in a letter to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, a New York Democrat. The letter underscores the deep rift in Washington over how to avoid a debt default. Republicans have repeatedly advocated spending cuts tied to the debt ceiling, while the White House has maintained it will not negotiate on that matter. Now, also over the weekend, we had the Senate Majority Leader and Chuck Schumer having a warning against these Social Security payments if we do not raise the debt ceiling. He said that Social Security payments could end if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling. So according to the Daily News, Social Security payments may come to a halt if Congress doesn't soon raise the national debt ceiling, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer warned on Sunday. It was his latest dire statement as lawmakers continue to struggle over increasing the federal government's borrowing limit, with Republican polls insisting on including big spending cuts in any deal. Schumer said, quote, "There are so many bad consequences to America failing on its debt," Schumer, a New York Democrat, said at a Midtown press conference. But one of the least noticed but most important is that it would stop the sending of Social Security checks to the tens of millions of seniors who depend on them. Now, of course, a lot of people are saying that this is just a scare tactic because a law back in 1996 would allow for the payments of Social Security and Medicare to continue to be sent out even if the debt ceiling is not raised. So according to most experts, Social Security payments could not be in harm or will not be in harm. Maybe they'll be a day or two late, possibly a week, but they should continue going out at least on a fairly timely basis. Now, even being a day or two late is too late, at least in my mind, but they should at least continue going out at least on a fairly normal basis. But that's all the news that we have for today's video. We should have more news later on this week, so make sure to stay tuned in. Now, if you made it all the way to the end, I definitely appreciate you watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed, again, I would definitely appreciate you giving this video a like. Consider subscribing to my channel if you have not already, and I will see you in the next video.